Given the impact of COVID-19, community-specific xenophobia, and national protests, and the presidential election, to say 2020 was a challenging year would be an understatement. Our panelists today will discuss the societal ramification of power structures affecting communities who experience marginalization and dysphoria, and explore how current events shape mental health narratives within the Asian diaspora. Audience members, we'll try to have time for some of your questions after our panel discussion. If you have any questions, please submit them on the chat box and me and Deep will read them. Today, we are excited and honored to have 4 distinguished guests in the mental health field to talk about issues that the Asian communities face as they work with the Asian community in their professional career. So with that, I turn to Dr. Jeannie Celestio to begin the introduction phase. Dr. Celestio, I think you're on mute.
Okay, there you go. Wow, sorry about that. Thank you all for joining us here today. And thank you to the Asian Mental Health Collective for organizing this amazing event. I have gnats from my plants, house plants. They're joining me today. My name is Dr. Jeannie Estela Celestial, and I am the daughter of 2 immigrants from Cebu and Cavite, Philippines. I was born on Chamorro land in the Pacific Islands called Guam, and I am currently a settler here on Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area. I am a licensed psychologist, coach, and consultant, and one of the authors of the Filipino Instant Pot Cookbook, and it's an honor to be here today. Thank you.
My name is Dr. DJ Ida, and I'm Executive Director of NAPIMA, the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a 3rd-generation Japanese American. And I've been working with the community for over 45 years in the area of mental health with Asian American, Native and Pacific Islanders. And I agree with Jean, it's a real honor, and thank you very much for holding this session and for us to be able to talk about mental health as it relates to Asian American, Native ones and Pacific Islanders. So thank you very much.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is EJ David. I am a Filipino American immigrant. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a husband and a father. And with my family, we live on the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina people, what is known as Anchorage, Alaska. And for work, I am a professor of psychology at UAA. Glad to be here.
My name is Nosheen Hadari. I am a Indian American Muslim immigrant, sometimes called first generation because came here very young, but I will say immigrant. I go by the pronouns she, her, and I am based in Chicago. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I've been working for the last 10 years here in the Chicago area, primarily doing work in public health, doing crisis intervention, doing work with the incarcerated population, and doing community mental health on the south and west sides of Chicago. And also working in private practice. Primarily now, I am the owner and main therapist at my own practice here in Chicago, where I primarily see couples and families and adult individuals. I do a lot of intercultural and interfaith work. I'm very happy to be here on this panel today. Thank you.
So hi everyone. So my name is Stephen, and I'm currently 1.5 generation Chinese American and I'm in my last year of pharmacy school at St. Louis College of Pharmacy in St. Louis, Missouri. My preferred pronouns are he, him, his, and so I'm really interested in mental health in the medical field because through my education, I find the psych illness, it was very fascinating and very interested in hopefully in the future utilizing that in my practice, especially with long-acting injectables in the treatment of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. I just hope that when I practice, I can definitely use that practice to work with the Chinese American community here in the States, especially. And with that, I'll pass it to Deep real quick.
Hi, folks. Welcome to our event, and thank you for having us as well. I'm Deep. I'm a queer trans Hijra South Asian American born in southern India, mostly raised in northern Illinois, 40 minutes north of Chicago. I attended Lawrence University to get my BA in biomedical ethics. I was looking at basically a holistic analysis of healthcare fields through a lens of stakeholders. And my interest in mental health came from my own experiences and my own peers' experiences with domestic violence, child abuse, and some other trauma-based environments. Right now, I'm focusing on graduate medical school applications with a long-term outlook on looking at clinical care and then also policy implementation for mental health services, specifically for folks of color. Thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate the time and space everyone's making for us today.
Thank you so much, audience members and our fellow facilitators for introducing yourselves. So with that, we can dive right into our questions that we have prepared for our panelists. So the first panelist, I would like to address Dr. Jeannie. So how do we as a community recognize the systemic racism and other isms and phobias present in our current society, especially in 2021 with COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and the xenophobia that's currently present in our states and beyond?
Wow. Those are really important questions, Stephen. Thanks. First of all, I believe that this question is really about how do we embody and live out our values of social justice and liberation for ourselves and for the most marginalized in our society. If folks value social justice and you aim to embody solidarity with Black and Indigenous lives, then I think it requires us to bravely explore and practice a few things, and I want to talk briefly about those. First, beginning with ourselves, starting within. I invite folks to examine our values, our power and privilege in order to explore our social location, intersectionality, and multidimensionality, where we fit in the social strata of society vis-a-vis others with more or less access or resources. And this process of self-examination is just the starting point. It's not meant to center ourselves in the struggle for liberation, but to acknowledge our role in oppression and how we benefit from oppression. For instance, I acknowledge that I'm a settler on stolen land. I'm a cisgender, straight, college educated. I have light skin. And how my body moves in the world has more access than other brown and Black bodies. And I can also use and leverage my power to learn myself, to love myself and my people more, as folks recovering from colonization and imperialism, and also learn to get to know and love other communities better. There are a few toolkits and resources that can help us in this journey of self-examination, and I'll post them in the chat, such as the Tatlong Bagsak movement. They have an open source toolkit that is grounded in empathy and compassion and helps us explore ourselves and work in trust to connect with our families and our communities to question racism and heal from it. So I will post those in the chat. Also, I do want to say something about cultural humility, and that means being open-minded to others, recognizing and respecting salient aspects of their cultural identity, and doing this as a lifelong commitment to learn more about the cultures of others and to work towards social change. And so I'll stop there and see if my other colleagues would like to chime in.
I think one of the things that you were talking about, which is really important, is the value of culture. Because oftentimes in this country, we are seen as sort of as if it's something that either is seen pathologically because somebody outside who doesn't understand who we are, redefine who we are from a negative perspective, or that because of the racism, it makes it very difficult for us to claim safely who we are, both physically and emotionally. So I think having that clarity that you were talking about of starting with how do we view ourselves? And that doesn't mean that all Asians see because the great diversity. But I think that's such an important place to start is just who are we? What are our experiences have been? And how does that impact our sense of self and how we interact with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I just want to add, I agree with everything that's been shared so far. I just want to add, just paraphrasing Asata Shakur, she said any community seriously concerned with its own freedom has to be concerned about other people's freedom as well, right? Like the victory of oppressed people anywhere in the world is a victory of all oppressed people. And each time one of imperialism's tentacles is cut off, we are closer to liberation. Imperialism is an international system of exploitation, and we as revolutionaries, if we want to be revolutionaries, need to be internationalists to defeat it. And so as Asian Americans, I think we must see our connections with the Black community and see our and see our connections with the Latinx community and the indigenous community, see how our struggles and our liberation are tied to each other. We must work with other peoples of color. As the fastest growing immigrant group in this country, Asian Americans, we are projected to surpass Latinx as the largest immigrant group in the US by the year 2055, I believe. So therefore, I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we do not simply become tools to further oppress indigenous peoples and other POCs. We cannot be complicit to the further erasure and forgetting of indigenous peoples and the oppression of other peoples of color. As a largely immigrant community, we have this mentality and drive to become successful in this country. But I think we must go beyond thinking of success simply in terms of like in economic terms. We must stop measuring success in terms of how close we are to whiteness. We must think of success in terms of how healthy and well our society and our world is. And in my view, one of the more important ways to keep these lands that we now call home healthy is to make sure that injustice and oppression does not happen in these lands. And so we must work with our indigenous relatives and other communities of color to make sure that we keep these lands healthy and well and free of injustice and free of oppression.
I love what everybody shared, so I will be brief. And I really appreciate what you just shared, EJ. I think, from a mental health perspective, what brings often people from the Asian countries and diaspora here is this kind of racial exceptionalism and this feeling that, we are this model minority and we can come here and we can do the hard work, we can achieve academically, we can achieve financially, economically. And so there is a distancing that I think that we do with other people of color, and that proximity to whiteness does afford us those privileges, if we want to call them that. But from a mental health perspective, it is very antisocial. It is very isolating. It is very encouraging of white supremacy, whiteness, proximity to whiteness supremacy. So I think, just kind of summarizing what all the panelists just shared, I definitely think that we need to look at the community that we come from and the greater community that we're a part of, instead of just this kind of focus on trying to achieve.
I think
Thank you so much. Go ahead, DJ. I'm sorry.
Oh no, just really briefly. Another thing when we're talking about Asian Americans, the data clumps us all together as if we are this homogeneous population, and so oftentimes they look at it. It's very skewed. The populations are doing well economically, the ones that are doing well educationally, and that really hides the very real serious problems that occur with so much of our other populations. And so I think that's the real danger of just seeing us as one group. And then also what everybody is saying is how we define what success is. And if success is defined only by economic success or how close we are to whiteness, that does a real damage because it denies the value of our cultural ways of doing things, which is something that, again, we need to be able to find a place that it's safe for us to be able to go into that place and to recognize the great diversity and all the social determinants of health that place different populations at different risk factors.
Yeah, and I just want to chime into what Nasheen was saying about just inviting folks to explore how living up to the model minority myth or this pressure to live up to it may be a manifestation of internalized oppression, whereby we may believe we have to prove ourselves by living up to white standards or capitalistic achievements in order to make it in America, and how that might one, make divisions among us between ethnic groups and within ethnic groups, and even in our families, such as taking time away with spending quality time with our children or elders, things like that. So talking about mental health, how do we bring it home? How do we apply it in daily life? So exploring that and asking ourselves, is how you're living every day in line with your overall vision for a just world, a just family, a just home?
Thank you so much to all our panelists who has so much great things to say. I could say that what we are talking about right now, it could fill an entire library very soon. So with that, it does transition to a really good point that I'm going to turn to Deep, and I'll let Deep take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So essentially, kind of piggybacking on what we were talking about here in the previous question, the next question we wanted to address was, how do we address mental health needs and services for specific intersectional groups within our Asian communities and beyond? And that could include BIPOC communities within mixed race, multiracial, and then also invisible intersectional groups that may need more attention. DJ, if you could provide some insight on that, perhaps.
First of all, I just wanted to go back, and I think what all the panels were saying about the first question is really important, but I don't think any of us are also implying that for those who are successful by different standards, that's bad. I think what it is, it's that it's important to redefine and broaden what is successful. So that kind of leads me into the way that I want to start this particular section, and it's how we even define what mental health is to begin with. Mental health is very narrowly defined in terms of looking at pathology, it's looking at diagnoses. And as a clinician, I was trained to talk about the individual. The first thing to ask is, what brings you here and what is your problem? I think particularly from a perspective of people of color, it is absolutely critical that we broaden the definition of mental health to really look at it from a public health, social justice perspective, and being able to look at it in terms of the other things that influence mental health. Racism is a mental health issue. We're looking at housing, employment, education, all of these things that we call social determinants of health. These are really important aspects to look at. So when we talk about what is your problem as an individual, we fail to look at all the issues that are around us. So, for example, when I was working with young kids, and if they were facing with racism, if I talk to them only about racism, that doesn't change the environment that they are living in. And that's where the problem lies. That otherwise we're coping with the person who's either a victim of or it's a symptom. So mental health really, really must broaden it so that it really takes a social justice approach. It encompasses all these things. And part of the question was, what can we learn from others? Part of it was answered in the first question, but it's understanding the value of Black Lives Matter. The issues that Black Lives Matter talks about isn't only for the Black community. All of us can learn something from that. What many of us have gathered from that, it's the power and the strength of reclaiming who they were. It's like, no, Black Lives Matter. We own this. You don't get to define for us who we are. That's a mental health issue. When it feels safe to be able to claim who we are. With the Latino community, the Latinx community, the promotores. The promotores takes, it's not just having a PhD or an MD. You're the only ones that are qualified to talk about mental health. Dealing with mental health existed long before we invented psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers. It's how we engage the community. That too is a mental health issue. If we look at the Native Americans, the understanding of spirituality. And the spirituality says that we are not in this world, we don't rule the earth. We are not here as individuals. We're here as part of a collective whole. So these are all the things that we can learn from others. We're looking at some of the subpopulations. And this is sort of going into the second part. So I'm going to finish this off and then open it to the panelists before we get to the second part of the question. But the thing that we have gone from looking at cultural, that I'm old enough that I remember when we were saying that we didn't have a culture unless you had the white culture. And we looked at cultural differences to cultural competency and cultural humility. So it really is valuing the kinds of things that each of our communities bring to the table. And I loved when you posed this question, this is how we learn and share from each other. So even though we have things that are distinct to the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, that doesn't mean that things that we cannot share with others, including the dominant white culture, and vice versa. So I'd like with that to sort of open it up and get comments from the fellow panelists.
I can chime in. Thank you, DJ. You know, I think there's a lot to be learned from our fellow other people of color and healers. Dr. Lillian Comas Diaz talked about how we should be bilingual in our approach to mental wellness. That is to draw from both Western psychology and tradition, such as traditional psychotherapy, and employ tools from our indigenous ways of knowing and healing, such as drum circles, dance, art, hip hop, spoken word, ethnic studies. So we can use and draw tools for wellness from various aspects of our communities. Also shared in the chat, the psychology of radical healing, which is about healing our identity-based wounds and being healing-centered, trauma-informed, and heal not only ourselves, but as DJ said, heal our communities and heal not only in this generation, but heal the traumas of prior generations and heal for the sake of future generations. So it's not only thinking individualistically, which often Western psychology is catered towards, like solving pathology in the individual, but healing as a collective and throughout generations.
I wanted to go back to the issue of historical trauma, because I think that's something that we see over and over and over within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. So whether it's as an immigrant, or if the issue happens to be with as a refugee or colonization, those are the traumas that get passed down from generation to generation. And sometimes it may not be as clear as the population that it first happened to, that those are the environments that we're growing up in. And again, one of the things that's really germane to this discussion, it's really looking at what does that do to our sense of self? And we know that one of the things about, none of us want to see anybody be a victim of crime of any kind. So there's nothing, oh, this crime is better than that crime. Racial crimes, crimes that are based on who we are, that type of oppression goes very, very deep, because it's not about being being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What racism does, and when we look at oppression, it's being the wrong person all the time, no matter where you are. And that's what's so insidious, because it makes it very, very difficult. And it's not to say there's one right way to be Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, but because somebody who lives, I'm in Denver, it might be very different from the experience of somebody who's in San Francisco or in Chicago or in New York. So it's not one way of doing it, but it's that place of being able to say it's safe for me to be able to go there. And working with the communities, I saw the secondary trauma over and over with the Southeast Asian refugees, with the kids and what it was like for them, because the world around them did not make it safe for them to be who they were. And they would sometimes find a way to be, and it served a purpose. So it wasn't to fault them for finding a way to be, but sometimes it wasn't the healthiest of ways to be, but it served a purpose. It gave them a place to be. So I think, again, all of these things about how we redefine what mental health is really, really important. And there are a couple of other things about systems, but I also wanted to throw it back to the rest of the panelists before I talk about some of the systems issues. Maybe let's throw this out really quickly because I want to make sure that we have time to go on to the other questions. What we're talking about mental health, again, as Jeannie was saying and others have talked about, is, I mean, I was trained to do talk therapy and I loved doing it. It was wonderful to be very powerful. There's so many other ways that we heal, and this is where it's bringing a cultural perspective. So building on what you were saying about the dance, the drum, if you have somebody who's been severely traumatized, the last thing you want to do is sit down and talk about their trauma. It once again puts them in a one-down position. It asks them to do something which is very foreign to their way of being, and that in of itself can be traumatizing. When we're dealing with trauma of any form, it's about healing. And we heal, we are allowed to do things, or we're given an opportunity to do things where we have a sense of competence. Talking in a foreign language about a subject that is very alien is not a place of competence. Gardening, fishing, going back to the dance, we need to redefine in this country what it is to heal from a cultural perspective. And those are just as legitimate and can be powerful and sometimes more powerful than the talk therapy. So it's not we have to do it this way or that way. But that's why these discussions are so important, because what we're talking about are all the elements in our lives and our world that affect us from a mental health standpoint, whether we call it mental health or not. So therefore, healing should not be just based on talk therapy or medication. These are all different forms of healing. And I think those are other things that, again, we don't have time to go into detail here, but having a chance to sort of work with communities around the country, they have taught me so much about how the community decides for themselves. This is what works, not the way you're doing it. And very, very briefly, what NAPIM has done it, and I'd like to send you over to the website Asians in Focus. We are starting a project about how you heal through the arts. And it's using dance, it's using music. And so we've got this project going, but if you just go to asiansinfocus.com, and there's some information there, and join us, because we'd love to hear what your stories are and how you use creativity to address mental health.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for kind of sharing that insight. It actually transitions perfectly into our next question. Stephen, if you want to take it from there.
Thank you again from our panelists, the great insight that you shared into question 2. So question 3 ties perfectly into question 2, in that how do historical sociocultural phenomena such as COVID-19, the Hong Kong democracy protest, the farmers' protests in India, Vietnam War, and etc. affect members of the Asian diaspora? For example, for the Black community, there's an exploration on post-traumatic slave syndrome, where Joy DeGruy shows the connection between institutional violence like slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and mass incarceration to have such an impact. That generation of the Black community are dealing with long-term intergenerational psychiatric and neuropsychological consequences. Also, this could be said the same for Holocaust survivors as well. And so I'm going to turn this question first to EJ and to see what are his insight on this question.
Thanks. This is a big question, and there are different ways to answer this. But I'm interpreting this question as about the effects of oppressive and traumatic socio-political phenomenon on Asians. So I will answer it that way. I will also focus on Asians in the US, but I think my response is applicable to the Asian diaspora more broadly. So, it's been alluded to already just a little bit ago, but the research on how race-based trauma affects peoples of color, including Asians, is clear. It can lead to poor mental health, poor self-esteem, lower life satisfaction, substance use, suicidal ideation. So trauma and its effects are real. But peoples of color don't just deal with the racism or the trauma that we directly experience. We also are forced to deal with the racist, traumatic experiences that our friends and family face. But not only that, we also feel the racist, traumatic experiences faced by other people who we don't even know, but who look like us. So if we see someone who look like us treated badly, that vicarious trauma affects us too, right? So when we see large-scale maltreatments of our people, when we see on TV how our people are dehumanized and othered and inferiorized, We feel that. It activates our fight or flight systems too. It makes us anxious, stressed out, maybe even scared, maybe even depressed too. We don't need to directly experience race-based trauma to be negatively affected by it, right? And then to take this concept of vicarious trauma even further, the traumatic experiences of our ancestors also affect us today. Historical trauma has been mentioned. It affects, the effects of it can be passed down to later generations. There's also some emerging epigenetic research that seems to support this. So all of those historical socio-political experiences of racism, of colonialism, of imperialism that regarded our communities as savages, as uncivilized, as inferior, those messages that damaged and messed up our ancestors, they can still inflict damages on us today, several generations later. And many of us have internalized these racist messages and have succumbed to them, coming to accept and believe that our peoples are indeed inferior. So today, many of us might feel ashamed or embarrassed of our ethnicities. Many of us might feel ashamed of our brown skin or our almond-shaped eyes. Many of us might use skin whitening products or get double eyelid surgery. Many of us might look down on other people in our communities who we think are not Americanized enough. We call them fobs, we make fun of their accents, and we regard them as backward or less intelligent. Many of us might even go to the point where we minimize the racist experiences we've faced, thinking that such racism is okay, because at least we're here. And that we should just work harder on our accents, work harder on our math homework, work harder on our jobs, work harder on being American, work harder on becoming white so that we can avoid racism. Many of us have become convinced that the closer we are to whiteness, then the better off we will be. Many of us have come to believe that our success and even our survival depended on how much we understood and adopted whiteness. So sure, the effects of historical socio-political phenomenon include mental health consequences, psychological distress, low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, substance use, suicide. That's one way to answer this question. But the effects of historical socio-political phenomenon also include loss of culture, loss of pride, loss of connection to our ancestors, loss of identity, loss of who we are. Therefore, putting us in a vulnerable position to replace what was our own with what white people tell us is better, putting us in a very vulnerable position to accept white supremacy. And I think that's probably one of the saddest and most insidious effects of oppressive, historical, political phenomena. Thanks.
Thank you, EJ, for sharing that insight. Wow, I feel like that was a lot to take in for in a few minutes, but definitely a lot of important stuff. And I was wondering, what does our panelist has anything else to say about this?
Of course, I've followed Dr. David's work for many, many years, and I wrote my dissertation incorporating colonial mentality and his colonial mentality scale into my research. And now as a therapist who treats trauma on a daily basis, I am really trying to get in touch with empathy and compassion for ourselves and our communities in regards to colonial mentality and internalized oppression. And when I say that, I mean that, like say in the Filipino community, we often kind of look down or tease each other for having these colonial mentality attitudes. And where I'm trying to apply compassion is seeing how we as people of color, as marginalized people, have internalized oppression as a way of surviving. And so, it responses to trauma or fight, flight, fight, freeze, or affiliate. And when we of internalized trauma. It may be out of our own survival and also our parents, trying to make it. So say, for instance, my parents didn't want me to learn Tagalog in the home. They wanted me to speak perfect English. They wanted me to not have an accent. They wanted me to succeed in school. And they were literally taught in their schooling in the Philippines not to teach your children the language. They were fined for speaking their native tongue in the school. And so they were just doing their best to pass on to me what they thought was going to be right and good for me. And so I appreciate their desire for me to be successful, quote unquote. However, now as an adult who really tries to practice Tagalog when I can, and just having compassion for their choice of doing that and not being angry at them anymore for not teaching me the language. And also now trying to impart the language on my third generation daughter. So I guess I just wanted to add that piece about compassion and empathy for ourselves and our families for the oppression that we have survived and are surviving on a daily basis.
Just kind of piggybacking on what the panelists shared, I think from a therapy perspective, I'm thinking about the narrative, the historic narrative. So we're talking about sociopolitical events and we're talking about history, and we know so much of what has happened is continuing to happen, and on such micro levels within family dynamics, and even mirrored within the body on a cellular level. So maybe we are second, third, fourth generation here in America, and we are feeling removed from our histories and those socio-political events of, maybe our great grandparents, and we're not so closely connected to those narratives. We hear stories here and there, but we don't know the intricacies of the experience. But on a cellular level, our bodies are still so impacted by it. So I think part of the work that I really think is important as Asian mental health practitioners in the US is to help to draw out those narratives. And I think one of the real benefits that we can kind of draw from with Asian clients is the family, the community. Often when I work with clients, even individually, I'll say, hey, if there's something that you're struggling with and it's specifically about something in your family dynamic or something relational, bring your mom in, bring your grandparents in, bring your children in. Let's have this become more of an intergenerational space, because it just adds so much more of that historic narrative. And I think, often when we think about like the stories that we come from, it's very much like younger people kind of being told these stories from the older generation. And in the therapy space, we don't get that. So when we invite more of that into the room, we really can enrich and broaden the experience and the understanding of what are those traumas, what are those narratives that are being carried in our clients' bodies that are unspoken. And we do that kind of narrative work all the time, but just to bring those voices into the room, I think can be very impactful.
Most definitely. I do think that with us Asian communities here in the West, that we do have a lot of bilinguals or trilingual speaking people here, and it's very important that we keep this tradition, as language can be a bridge to bridge the divide. So with that, this will be a good segue to transition to our fourth and final questions, and I'll turn it over to Deep.
Yeah, and touching upon that previous question too, one of the things we wanted to ask the panel, starting with Nasheen, was how can the Asian diaspora confront its complex status within the myth of white supremacy so that we can reclaim a healthier identity for ourselves on an individual and collective level? And then what does this also look like for intergenerational family relationships and our place and role in historically marginalized communities? And just as a quick workup, historically marginalized as in systemic violence against specific groups of folks, often perpetuated by majority culture groups. If you wanted to take it away, Nishi.
Yeah, and I think this is a good question segueing into what we were just talking about, because we often are, this happens a lot in the therapy room, where like the thing that has made a client successful in some way in their life is the very thing, the very quality that's also creating some stressors in their life. So how do we help them unlearn those things when actually in society it's benefiting them in some way? Often those personality traits, characteristics, those behaviors mirror white supremacy, capitalism, a more kind of colonial mentality on what it means to be thriving and successful. It's very individualistic. And as Asian Americans, I think that's something that we could probably all agree is not hugely part of our value system. We are from communal and collectivist cultures, and the reason we can do well and we come here and we can thrive is largely in part to our connection to the collective. I know so many immigrants who move here and they move to where their families are. They move to where they've already got some established sense of community. And they stay with friends of friends, with family members, with relatives, maybe ones that back in their home countries they weren't even that close with. But once they come here, it's, hey, we're here together. We're going to help each other. And so you see this value system sort of, I don't want to say it changes, but complex is really the right word to use, because how do you hold the complexity? How do you do the both and of individual and thriving and supporting yourself and your nuclear family, and then also keep in mind the collective, the community? And I think what was said before about like disconnection and losing part of your culture is very much something that I see a lot in my therapy room. I think that like access to and proximity to whiteness, I've heard so many people come in, and well before I was a therapist, so many friends from South Asian communities share that they were not allowed to be in relationships or marry anybody who was Black, who was Latino. They couldn't bring anybody home who belonged to certain racial groups because of that colonial mentality that is so prevalent in us before we even get here. And I think it's interesting to see this kind of Black Lives Matters movement and the need for solidarity with the Black community and with the Latinx community, with indigenous communities, because largely I would say when I was growing up in the 90s here in the suburbs of Chicago, there was a lot of this kind of like believed criminality of the Black community. You go to these communities, like these people are violent, right? These are the messages that you get, and it's because you're listening to whiteness. And that's part of propagating systemic racism, is turn the other Black and brown people against each other too. And I think it's really fascinating too to see, with the election of our vice president, this shift. Now all of a sudden there's this validation of like the Black experience, or the Black and Indian interracial marriages and relationships. And I will tell you that I would have heard throughout my life, and I hear time and again in my therapy space, how otherized the Black community is in Indian and South Asian communities and families, and how specifically called out young folks are when they try to engage in relationships with and bring home people from these different communities. So I think there's, now that this person has achieved this status, okay, now they're validated in our narratives, but what about the like inner city Black community? What about the people who are struggling? What about the people who are, the recipients of systemic oppression and racial profiling? When we are not part of them, do we still see ourselves as responsible and accountable to them? I think, specifically, I belong to the Muslim community here in Chicago, and the Muslim ban, racial profiling for the Muslim community has drawn out a real complexity about, the way a lot of Muslim Americans identify. There's a lot of conservatism in Muslim Americans. There's a lot of kind of like that same bootstrap mentality or, NIMBYism in Muslim communities because, they kind of largely see themselves as part of that model minority. But once there's a Muslim ban, who's marching with you? It's Black and Latino people, right? So, when do we have solidarity, and when do we become complicit, and when are we bystanders, and when is silence violence? I mean, these are very kind of complex issues and statuses that we hold in society. There is a researcher, Jun Zhu, who talked about this marginalized model minority of this kind of like triangulation of Asian Americans against Blacks. So we are above the Black community in that kind of racial status, but we are still below whites. And so, we benefit from that hierarchy and that structure, but only, I think, economically and probably also kind of socioeconomically. Like, we are not imprisoned, we are not, shot and killed, we are not, living in impoverished communities at the same rates as Black Americans. So in some ways, our success relies on their oppression. But I think that the word complex really gives appreciation to all of the different kind of roles that we play. And I think that there's a lot that can be confronted specifically in the therapy room, because what we can do with clients is we can really call them out and call them in to better understand these parts of themselves, and that maybe that voice in them is not them. Maybe it is white supremacy.
No, thank you for that breakdown. That was actually extremely helpful in trying to understand how the macro and the micro kind of go along with each other. We did mention we were taking audience questions, and after reviewing a couple of them, we want to bring the panel to address one or two kind of combined questions. So the main question that came up was looking on the issue of, as the Asian community, as providers, as leaders, how can we help destigmatize mental health for our peers and family to engage these services and related to healthy notions of mental health outlook? And related to that, what are healthy aspects of reclaiming our identities so that folks can recognize when adopting an identity can actually go beyond a model minority myth, so that we can be a better neighbor to our sibling communities like the Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities? If folks would like to jump into that.
On that last part there, one having to do with, well, I'll start with the first one. We're talking about how do we destigmatize it. I think COVID-19, in a strange way, one of the things it did is it brought mental health out of the shadows. And it wasn't something that happens to others. It's something that can happen to any of us. And that's the first thing about normalizing mental health and taking the stigma away, is just to say it's a normal part of our lives. It's not something that means you did something wrong. It's not something that makes you less than. And for part of it's just the awareness that individuals, anybody, could experience some very serious mental health issues. That does not at all stop your competence, but it also means what are the things that we need to do to support each other, to support ourselves, And part of that is to claim who we are, because we do know that when it's safe for us to be who we are, that's a place that we can go to. And that's part of our healing, it's part of the community. But we just really need to have a lot more awareness about what mental health really is and what it is not. And to not be afraid to go to the places that really are kind of difficult.
I would like to speak to how to destigmatize mental health in our communities. I'm a part of one movement called Filipinx Mental Health Initiative, particularly Solano County and also in San Francisco. But part of these organizations' goal is to make mental health services accessible to the general public. And in order to do that, making it more visible. So I want to talk about the power of social media to destigmatize mental health, making short videos about people seeking mental health services or talking about their mental health struggles, putting on events that are social, culturally responsive, that might be bilingual or incorporate music or dance or storytelling, things that our communities can wrap their heads around. So we have to really think creatively and meet our communities where they're at, culturally and linguistically, and just being able to talk about these issues openly, such as a conference like this, I think really does help destigmatize mental health issues.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of what you just shared, Jeannie, I think, intercultural community forums, conversations, dialogues, in any way that we can get them. I think a lot of times Asian Americans are sometimes reluctant to engage in maybe therapy and really airing out their kind of dirty laundry in their families and their relationships. So if they can kind of see that normalized, I think that could be very encouraging of the discourse. And I also think that, I'm just thinking kind of off the top of my head, two places that Asian Americans really tend to seek guidance: schools and maybe religious or cultural institutions. If if I get a young Asian American client referral, it's often through the school system, because that's when often parents or family members will engage and actually follow through with those services, because it's kind of being encouraged by the school system for their child to seek therapy, for instance. I also think that cross-cultural discourse could be helpful. Like, remember after September 11th and a lot of kind of like efforts to shed more light on the Muslim faith and kind of to combat the terrorist trope. A lot of mosques in the US were holding kind of cross-cultural community conversations at mosques and actually opening their doors to invite people in to show, this is our community, this is how we pray, this is how we eat, this is who we are, come and be with us. Those kinds of events, obviously right now, we're not doing, but I think that from that social media perspective, there's so much more access to one another now, and we can really kind of encourage these kinds of conversations. I know there's a lot more kind of Instagram and Facebook lives and those kinds of conversations happening virtually, so that people can access and understand about one another without kind of having to kind of stay within their own shell.
So that actually leads to another question we have from our audience, which is a perfect segue for cross-cultural discourse. So one of our audience members asked, as the term Asian includes so many cultures, where does Asian culture draw similarities, and where do we differentiate when addressing mental health?
It's a really, it's a really good, it's a critical question. And it's not an easy one to answer because by saying the things that are similar, we don't want to get into stereotypes. All Asians are like this. But some of the things that hold us together, and Asians aren't the only ones also that have these values, but it's very, very germane to who we are as Asian American, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders. It's a sense of group versus the individual, which is one of the core things between how we see things in the Western world, very much in the US, where it's all about me, me, me. And that sense of family is very, very important. So when that gets broken up and changed, that's very different. The way that we perceive mental health could be very different. So it could be, if you go from community to community, some of it can be based on religion. It could be on cultural beliefs, a lot of different ways. And I don't think we'll have time to go into the differences of each one. But I think the thing that really does hold us together, which is sort of a common bond, is that sense of the group and the family is really, really core. And that's a huge part of our healing. So when Marcin was talking about that in the work that she does, it's really important that we do see the individual as part of the collective whole. I think that's a real strength that we have, that we can teach the rest of the world. It's a good way to be.
Thank you so much, DJ, for answering that question. So with that, our sociocultural panel unfortunately has to come to a close, but all this conversation we had today could be talked about over a coffee and for a long period of time. I want to thank our panelists today for taking their time out of their busy schedule and coming on to our conference and for sharing your words of wisdom. And to those who are just coming on here, feel free to stay with us as we progress through this rest of the conference and have more panels to come. And again, on behalf of me, Deep, and the rest of AMHC, we thank you again for coming on to our panel with Sociocultural.
Thank you.
Thank you as well, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.